This is the ultimate power.
Looks like they finally did it. We finally got a complete and polished Sonic game, praised by the majority of people, and it's actually entirely enjoyable. Congratulations, Sonic team. It only took you 7 years to make an amazing Sonic game, the last one being Mania back in 2017. Well, that wasn't really made by them, so it's more like 13 years with the original Sonic Generations back in 2011. Huh. That's kinda sad, actually. Cynicism and jokes aside, it's good to finally have a completely enjoyable game from this franchise after so many years of mediocrity. Within those past 13 years, we've got experimental games, unfinished titles, terrible garbage, or a mix of those with only one standout title, that being Sonic Mania. Sonic Dream Team is also an exception, but let's be real here, who's actually played this game? If it wasn't locked behind Apple Arcade, I'd be singing a different tune, but I'm getting off track. So after over a decade of ups and mostly downs, a Generations remaster with a new side game was intriguing, but also extremely concerning right off the bat. This is the same company who remastered multiple games and somehow made them worse. You expect me to believe that they'll make another remaster and somehow nail it? It's pretty bad when I saw Generations looking practically unchanged and was just relieved. No enhanced graphics or tacky cosmetics, just the same game as you knew it. Some were let down by this, and that's fair enough. But at the same time, Generations already looks great even today. There's no need for enhancements outside of the technical stuff like higher frame rates. Besides, I wouldn't want them to plaster a bunch of bloom all over the screen. There was also this. So yeah. Putting Generations aside, the main draw was the new content that they were adding. An entirely new game focused on Shadow and his past, in Shadow Generations. Basically a side game / sequel to Sonic Generations. And yeah, this looks kinda familiar. But comparisons aside, would this be good? Would it even be as good as Sonic Generations? Well, before hopping into Shadow Gens, you're getting a modern port of Sonic Generations, one of the best games in the series. So what's different? What's new? What's better? And what's worse? Well, for starters, if you've played the original gens, this is practically the exact same game. To make it quick and simple, this is the PC version of the game running on consoles, so you've got a higher resolution, better textures, and better frame rate. The standard stuff, really. Different consoles will run at different resolutions and frame rates, but the highest you'll get is 4K resolution at 60 FPS. Unfortunately, the game doesn't support 120 FPS gameplay, but I understand the limitations. If you're looking into more of the specific technical side of things, Digital Foundry's got a great video on that stuff, so I suggest watching that for more details. After watching this video, obviously. Some additional features are also included, such as the drop dash, for Classic Sonic and Modern Sonic. Now, Classic makes sense, it's practically designed for him, but why Modern? In what world would I rather use the drop dash over a boost? It's not faster or better than a boost, and the execution of the move is extremely awkward. I'd much prefer just keeping it on Classic only, and even then, it's not like I'm in dire need of it either. If it wasn't here at all, I wouldn't even care. The next addition is the Chow Rescue. In each stage, there's 3 hidden Chow that you can find and rescue. That's it. No reward, no incentive, no bonus points or anything. The best you get is an achievement for finding them all. It's pointless, moving on. Rewritten story dialogue. Now this is a bit more interesting. The plot follows the exact same structure as the original, but all of the dialogue has been completely rewritten, and in some cases have added dialogue, primarily when saving characters. And let me be completely honest here, I don't really care for it. At the very least, I think it's nice that they've added dialogue when saving other characters, since they were very awkward and clearly rushed by not giving Sonic any lines. The new rewrite gives him actual voice lines, so at the very least, it's a nice addition that fixes a small issue from before.
Ha! Get in line, knucklehead. Alright.
But aside from that, it's nothing too special. The story is still the same shallow walkthrough as it was before. Maybe a few extra references here and there, and some of the voice actors were changed, so that's something. But again, not a big change. Back to gameplay, by default, the game follows a control scheme similar to Sonic Frontiers. So boost is set on the right trigger, with homing attack on X and A, assuming you're using Xbox inputs, and the drift is now on the left trigger. But it's kinda obvious this was done in a cheap way. X isn't mainly for homing attacks, it's just another input for jump and homing attack. So in essence, you can still homing attack with the A button, just that X does the same thing now. This also means that the spin dash for Classic Sonic is now on the right trigger, which isn't bad, but it's certainly weird. I don't know why they configured it this way, but it does the job. Muscle memory did end up taking over a few times, but I was able to adjust after a while. However, if you prefer the original control scheme, they do give you a preset for that alongside fully customizable control mappings if you want something completely different. Now, my main concerns were focused primarily on the base game and its overall functionality. The OG gens was put together pretty well, but there's still a handful of issues that could have used some fixing. For those who don't know, the PC port of Generations screwed up a few parts of the original game, making certain actions or shortcuts broken. For example, a few scripting errors are present on certain ramps, so when you launch off them, Sonic could spaz out in the air, which could end up messing with gameplay in unintentional ways. There's also this rail in Sky Sanctuary, where 90% of the time, you're unable to hop off the rail to reach a shortcut. Wall jumps are also broken, as you never slide down the wall properly, and either reattach to the wall immediately, or have a seizure. And the sidestep sound effect was bugged, so it never played whenever using it. There's also the menus for selecting skills, as it's a bit unintuitive and slow. You need to select a skill set, customize it, confirm your changes, change the name, select from a long list of words, confirm that, open a menu, and equip the skill set. There's too many menus and confirmations that could definitely use a rework, and selecting a name from a limited set of words was less than ideal. On PC, there's also the separate configuration tool, which was the only way to change the graphic settings, as the game itself didn't have an in-game menu for it. It was clunky, didn't work sometimes, and was kinda garbage. There's also a few smaller issues, like pop-in, restarts using lives, and other small differences compared to the original console release. So in the case of the Generations Remaster, they were given an opportunity to fix these problems. Granted, they're not game-breaking by any means, but some fixes would definitely be appreciated, especially for the errors that affect some of the gameplay. So did they fix them? Kinda. I mean, they did fix a few things, but not as much as I hoped. They've added an optional toggle for lives, so now you can play the game with no live system at all, making speedrun attempts and restarts less annoying. Wall jumps are also completely fixed, so they work just as intended. The sidestep sounds work completely fine, and the graphic settings can now be changed within the game's menu itself, so there's no need for an external config tool. As for the rest of the issues, nothing's changed. So this rail is still broken, some ramps are still broken, and this menu is still stupid. Can't say I'm too surprised, but I'm certainly disappointed. I assumed this was to keep the game's glitches intact and not to mess with what was already used in speedruns. But I don't think that's a good reason either, because these small errors are clearly separate from other glitches, so I don't really understand the lack of patches here. The opportunity showed itself, and they did something, which is better than nothing, but they definitely could have done more. And strangely, the load times are longer than the original game. On PC, the load times are practically non-existent. They usually finish in a second or two. But in the remaster, they take a bit longer for some reason, like to the point where you might see the "now loading" text show up. You'd never see that on the original PC version, so it's kinda surprising to see that on the remaster. Maybe it's better on PS5? Who knows. Either way, the game is still 99% the same. A few changes here and there, some extra features, and that's it. So whatever worked in original Generations will most likely work here too. That even includes some glitches, for better and for worse. I'm just glad they didn't ruin the core game itself. So let's move on to the real meat of the game here, Shadow Generations. Now this part of the game has a lot more riding on it. Not only did this have to meet the same quality standards of Sonic Generations, but this had to be a good impression for newcomers as a way to build hype for the third Sonic movie. And also, this had to integrate Shadow's backstory and somehow give a compelling narrative while being consistent with Sonic's rival battle in Generations. So if this part of the game ends up missing the mark, that third movie has a lot of heavy lifting to do for Shadow. But you'll see shortly that it's not too big of a concern. Practically speaking, this is an entirely new game made separate from the original Generations, so that means the game engine and physics are completely different, but they are close enough. Regardless, the core gameplay is still the same. Go fast, find shortcuts, and do it well to cut down your time. You've got a ton of stages from the past and some from the future as well. There's a handful of challenge stages, which are now mandatory to complete, a few bosses to fight, new powers to obtain, and lots of collectibles to find, both in the stages and in the open hub world as well. The major difference between this game and Shadow Generations are Shadow's abilities and the new powers he obtains throughout the game. Small changes were made to the core moveset, like sidesteps being shorter or longer depending on how long you hold the button for. And instead of a short air dash, you get a double jump, which means a lot for aerial traversal, especially for speedruns. Chaos Spear acts as a simple projectile, good for activating switches, destroying targets, and stunning enemies with shields around them. Chaos Snap replaces the homing attack, so now it can bypass walls and hazards between you and the enemy. And although there's no light speed dash, there's a similar move with Chaos Dash. Activating Chaos Control and touching these green glowing points take you through a long path, which is usually the best path forward if the opportunity ever presents itself. Chaos Control is by far your best ability. Build up the meter, and once activated, you can freeze time and almost every object around you for 5 seconds. This is great not only for stopping the timer itself, but also freezing obstacles to use as platforms, access certain routes before they're destroyed, or keeping enemies idle to attack them before they get away. Perfecting these abilities and using them at the right time is key to achieving the optimal run. However, Chaos Control adds a whole new layer to playing through these stages. Since it freezes almost everything, you might end up stopping objects at the wrong time. Objects that would move you upwards no longer do. Pillars that would open up the path forward will stay shut. These consequences for activating Chaos Control give it some nice risk and reward. You want to activate the ability to cut down your time and reap its benefits, but you don't want to activate it and risk waiting around either. If you don't activate it at all, you avoid any potential problems, but you miss out on a huge time saver. It adds a nice layer to replaying these stages, something you could never really get out of the other games. What also comes to mind is managing both your Chaos Control meter and your boost meter. Enemies only fuel Chaos Control, so boost can only be refilled via rings, and there's plenty of moments where you could find yourself surprisingly low on it. Unfortunately, that's also where you realize the slow acceleration for basic movement, and that's what you really want to avoid. Platforming without the boost is way stiffer than I'd expect, and the double jump really doesn't help it. In some way, it could be seen as a punishment for wasting your boost, so it's also a good idea to keep an eye on how much you've got left, otherwise you're taking things at a dreadfully sluggish pace. But when you're in need of Chaos Control, you can choose to seek out more enemies instead of just taking the fastest paths. Take the start of Rail Canyon Act 2 for example. Sticking to the top route has a few enemies and it's generally the fastest path. But once you get to this part, you realize you don't have enough energy to activate Chaos Control and activate Chaos Dash. An optimal path would be to head down at this part instead, so you can hit these two enemies and get enough meter to use Chaos Dash. It's these small reroutes and detours that really shake things up when implementing Chaos Control into your runs. Instead of the game being solely focused on finding the fastest path forward, you'll also want to see if you can save time by finding enough enemies while keeping the pace going. If you find the optimal routes, you could end up stacking Chaos Controls on top of each other, which can shave off a lot of time at once. It's a system with its own unique spin, and becomes just as satisfying to execute well once you get the hang of it. Outside of Shadow's main abilities, he also unlocks new ones as the game progresses, through Doom powers. There's Doom Spears, Blast, Surf, Morph, and Wings. With the exception of the last one, which is a glorified super transformation, these Doom powers are mainly a way to change up the gameplay a bit. Doom Spears are basically a multi-target Chaos Spear, meant for multiple targets or switches. Doom Blast is used on specific enemies, launching them up and away, teleporting you to where they're sent and allows access to unreachable paths. Doom Surf is your method of water traversal, with a nice spin attack for quick movement. And Doom Morph is, honestly, the weakest in my opinion. After hitting these purple blobs, you can swim through specific terrain and grapple onto specific points as well. It's a bit finicky to maneuver, and the grapple took some time to get used to, but after understanding the ability, it's alright. The Doom Spears are probably my favorite, as they keep the pace going and allow shortcuts as long as you react fast enough. If you're mindlessly boosting ahead, you'll end up missing the chance to hit some targets and waste a bit of time. And for flying enemies surrounded by shields, it forces you to pay attention a bit more during the usual homing attack chain. Instead of just mashing a single button to move along, you'll need to throw a spear and attack afterwards. A nice change of pace, especially in the later parts of the game where shielded enemies are more common. Thankfully, all of these abilities are never jarringly different to the core gameplay. They still focus on fast platforming and never overstay their welcome either. The standout ability though are the Doom Wings. These are given a bit of a weird introduction. You're given this ability in the second stage specifically, but afterwards it's never usable until the final stage is open. I guess it's a way to give you a test drive or something? I don't know. Anyways, like I said before, the Doom Wings are the glorified super transformation, given right before the last stage. With 50 rings, you can activate the wings, granting full invincibility and the ability to glide through the air using your boost meter. And since they're given to you right before the final stage, they're able to design 2 levels specifically around this ability just like the other Doom powers. The one difference between the wings and the other Doom powers is that they can be activated any time as long as you have the rings for it. So obviously, with previous stages that are not designed around the wings, they can be easily broken if you want to do so. But thankfully, they separate level times depending on if you have the Doom Wings enabled or not. And that was definitely a smart design choice to make. The wings are definitely a fun ability to mess with, and I'm glad they aren't as horrendous as the super forms in Sonic Generations. Although, I still would have liked to see a proper super form, just as a nice bonus or something. Either way, the Doom Wings provide a fun way to replay older levels, and the ability to glide is overpowered, but not full on broken, since gliding is limited by your boost meter. By the end of the game, there's plenty of new moves at your disposal, and while it might be a lot more than your average Sonic game, the challenge stages and main levels help ease you into each ability's capabilities. And it's a good thing the challenges are actually fun. There's not as much as Sonic Generations, but they're all short and sweet, unlike Sonic Generations. More on that later though. Outside of the main stages and challenges, you're probably exploring the White Space Hub, which is now an open area with collectibles spread around. If you played Frontiers, this is kinda similar to that. Look around, find a few items, play a short challenge, and move on to the next level when you're bored of it all. It's a nice break in between the main stages, with a bunch of collectibles to get as neat extras. Some of these collectibles are hidden pretty well too. You gotta keep a close eye out for some of them. Most items are also locked behind certain tokens that you can find in every stage and challenge. It might sound bad to go back into a stage and find these tokens just to earn an extra item, but the base game is already so fun and the stages are never too long to make that an issue. If you didn't find one your first time through, it's most likely on a different route, so it's never too difficult to find them all anyways. And when it comes to collecting everything in White Space, the Doom Wings became nearly essential for the convenience, and I appreciate having the option to warp to any stage you've played. Saves a lot of time for exploration and backtracking, but the White Space Hub isn't perfect. First of all, when you beat the main stages in an area, the boss gate shows itself, so you go ahead and reach it. But when you get there, it reveals the challenge stages, which are required to access the boss gate. So now you have to go back to the challenges, finish all of them, and then head back to the boss gate. Why not just show the boss gate and the challenges at once? I don't know why the back and forth is needed. It's especially bad in the third area, where the boss gate is underground, you reach it, and then the challenges show up above the ground. So now you gotta get back up, play the stages, get back down, and fight the boss. The extra step really isn't needed, I could have gone without it. And with these bolts, there's 80 of them scattered around the hub world, and none of them are marked on the map or anything. So when I'm trying to find all the bolts, it's not too bad until you've got 1 or 2 left, so I end up scanning the entire map multiple times just to find the last few bolts. I would have appreciated some sort of radar or indicator for the last few, but instead I gotta rely on some online guides because I don't want to run around the entire map for the 10th time. And you don't even get anything big for collecting them all, just another extra collectible. I would have liked something more than this little rocket joke, but honestly, I don't know what I was expecting. Anyways, on to the stages themselves. First of all, Shadow has 3 less stages than Sonic does in his generations, since Shadow doesn't really have a classic era. So we only get 6 main stages here, which are mostly great picks from past games and future games as well. Space Colony Arc, Rail Canyon, Kingdom Valley, and Sunset Heights are solid choices overall. But Chaos Island makes no sense. Shadow's never even been here before. Sunset Heights makes sense because he's been here in the future, but even in the future, Shadow doesn't ever visit Chaos Island, let alone the Starfall Islands. It's just a baffling choice, honestly. It's even worse when there's not a single stage from Shadow's own game. No Westopolis, Iron Jungle, Mad Matrix, nothing. And you could say that Space Colony Arc counts as a Shadow the Hedgehog stage, but that's clearly not the case since the stage follows more of SA2's Final Chase instead of Shadow the Hedgehog's Arc stage. Instead, Sonic Adventure 2 gets to double dip, with Space Colony Arc and Radical Highway being included. And honestly, I don't mind that, especially given the significance of Radical Highway being Shadow's first stage in the series. But I really wish they replaced Chaos Island with something from Shadow's own game. It's seriously missed potential, and that's unfortunately set in stone. Outside of the stage choices, the levels and their designs are very well made. It's about the same level structure that Sonic Generations had. Multiple paths, high ones are usually faster, and if you miss a shortcut, you fall down to a slower path. Same case goes for Shadow, and thankfully it translates well. This time though, stages are much longer in length. Even considering an optimized speedrun, these stages are generally over 2 minutes long, with some stages being longer at around 3 minutes. It's a nice in-between from Unleashed and Generations. Stages can be short and sweet, but not too short where the stage gets underwhelming, and not too long where it overstays its welcome. And this time around, levels can be very open in design, mostly thanks to the game's take on the Act 1 and 2 structure. With Sonic Gens, Act 1 was a full 2D level with his classic counterpart, whereas Act 2 was both 3D and 2D with modern Sonic. Here in Shadow's levels, stages still follow the Act 1 and 2 setup, but Act 1 is a fully 3D level, and Act 2 is a fully 2D level. This is probably the best way to handle the act structure and the 2D to 3D gameplay. It addresses the complaints for modern Sonic's levels, where 2D sections felt unnecessary because classic Sonic had provided that gameplay anyways. This time around, 2D and 3D are now fully split into their own levels, so if you prefer 3D gameplay in its entirety, a whole act will be dedicated to that. And with the idea of completely 2D levels, that might be a bit concerning to some. Forces and Frontiers has absolutely soured the concept of 2 dimensions due to the lack of design and quality. However, the 2D levels are actually really fun here, almost as fun as the 3D stages. I'm almost inclined to say that these are the best 2D boost levels we've had so far, and it's for a few reasons. For one, the levels are still tightly designed, so you're not getting a Forces boost to win type deal here. Shadow's abilities are still fully realized and put to great use, with reaction time being just as important. The second reason is the dynamic camera and flexible level design. Again, Forces highlighted the weaker parts of this gameplay, with a generally flat level layout that barely put its Z-axis to use. It's always left to right, but basically never moved into the foreground or background. The camera was similarly tilted, usually moving ahead of you for gameplay, but rarely changed its angle or hit a dynamic shot. Maybe a small tilt or two, but that's all you're getting. Shadow Generations follows more closely from Sonic Gens and Unleashed, and even adds on top of it. 2D levels are functionally 2D, obviously, but the game is still flexible in where you'll be going. You'll be sent to the background, around a tower, or through a tight tunnel, and this is where the camera work comes along. It moves around a lot, either for automated spectacles or to show you what's ahead, and that second part is what I really adore. Even in Sonic's levels, 2D was nice, but the camera wasn't always the best at showing you what's coming. It's either too zoomed in or just not giving a good angle for upcoming obstacles. Unless you're not boosting, the only way you're reaching some shortcuts is basically memorization. In Shadow's levels, not only is boosting so much slower than it is in 3D, but the camera sometimes angles itself to point way ahead of you to help plan your movements. And I can't say this enough, please do this more. I adore the speed you can reach in Sonic's levels, but the camera is an essential part of what makes the game work. If I can't see what's ahead, I'm bound to run into something good or bad. Either reduce the speed or show me what's up ahead, or in this case, do both, because it works wonders. As for both acts, each stage usually revolves around a few unique gimmicks, keeping things different on top of their newly acquired abilities. And thankfully, each gimmick is enjoyable and parallel to what the core gameplay offers, so no level is ruined by an annoying or frustrating gimmick that slows you down. I honestly can't even think of a stage that I dislike. The 3D levels are definitely better than the 2D ones, but both are still very enjoyable to play through. I guess Radical Highway can be a bit of a slog without the Doom Wings, since they're inherently designed around them. But it's still not terrible, just a bit awkward. As a plus though, Radical Highway is also the only stage without a 2D level, so I guess that makes up for it in some way. Actually, the moments where Doomsday transports you to Radical Highway does get a bit intrusive and repetitive. In 3 of the main stages, you'll be interrupted by Doomsday and transported to Radical Highway, which looks nice visually, but really interferes with the main level and gameplay itself. It's an in-game cutscene that you can't skip, and it can be a bit annoying for replays and speedruns. Besides, if I want to play through Radical Highway, there's already a dedicated level for it. To have it intrude in the middle of these stages makes sense story-wise, but gameplay-wise, it's a bit iffy. It doesn't help that these sections are designed in a very straightforward manner. It throws out the gimmicks of the base stage, and even restricts chaos control usage, so it's not exactly thrilling mechanically. And this is another small oddity I've noticed, but the game almost never utilizes the slide in its levels. There were only 2 circumstances where a slide was ever needed, and that was in post-game content in one challenge level. The same situation applied to Forces and Frontiers as well, where you could use the slide, but it was always optional and never needed. I don't know why they rarely use it, but it was a glaring omission in the levels. I think the game justifies the lesser use, since you have so many other abilities instead. But the previous games definitely could have benefited from it, given their lower difficulty and all. That's besides the point though. But overall, every level is fun to play through. There's not really a level I fully despise or dread, and any low points are minor issues at best. There's a few things I'm not a very big fan of, but it's never to a point where a stage is entirely ruined for me. The core gameplay still remains intact and fun throughout. Stage gimmicks are well designed, enemy placement was never unfair, and there was never a dull moment. Again though, Radical Highway segments are a slight exception. But on to the rest of the game stuff, the challenges and bosses. Now the challenges have seen a bit of a change. Instead of being offered a bunch of challenges to choose from like in Sonic Gens, Shadow only gives you 2 challenge stages for each act. And now every challenge is mandatory, which might sound sketchy at first. Some challenges from Sonic Generations were kinda not good, but a handful were actually really fun. The only problem was just trying to find the fun challenges and avoid the bad ones. Thankfully, Shadow Gens cuts out the fluff and only gives you the good challenges. There's not a single one that skimps out on gameplay. It's all still boosting and jumping here, not some slow slop to pad out game time. I mean, these are padding to a certain extent, but they're not terrible, you know? Obviously, these aren't the same quality as the main stages, but they're still enjoyable to play in their own right. And the same could be said for the bosses. These are all generally fun, and thankfully there's not a single one that I found obnoxious or tediously slow. I mean, there's always going to be those slower moments where you're waiting around for an opening, but thankfully it's never too egregious. The Bio-Lizard was a great first boss, Metal Overlord was pretty fun with the Doom Surf, Mephiles wasn't too bad, and Devil Doom was a nice test of all your abilities. But again, Doomorph played super awkward here, even after getting used to the movement. If they didn't have these safety springs for falling, I'd be losing my mind for sure. Still though, it was a nice end to the game, especially with the Doom Wings basically acting as a super form for this fight. It certainly beats out the Time Eater as a final boss. In fact, these bosses are much better than what they offered from Sonic gens. Sure, you miss out on some of the rival battles, but I'd much rather have a few fun boss fights rather than have more and risk a few bad ones. And visually speaking, these boss fights are full of spectacle. Whether it's in the middle of the battle, or the final blow with the same basic QTE, the game never fails to show off some nice effects. And that goes for the whole game really. All the animations are on point, in-game cutscenes are extremely good like I've said before, and the story cutscenes aren't half bad either. I really like the speed lines in 2D, they really push that sense of speed without being too bland or intrusive. The result screen animations are still great, and seeing old stages remade in higher quality is just top notch. I'd probably be more excited for older stages if they hadn't already done that like 10 times at this point, but I can't lie, they did a great job bringing all the stages back faithfully, while still taking some creative liberties here and there, especially for Sunset Heights and Chaos Island. They really had to add on to those levels because they are bone dry in aesthetics. I do have one issue with the game's graphics, and it's this weird dithering motion blur effect whenever you're moving quickly. It'll be a bit harder to show since YouTube compression already messes with the picture of the video, but it's much more clear when you're actually playing and very noticeable when you're boosting. It's definitely a different type of motion blur the game uses, but I personally found it a bit distracting to see. I know that previous games also had motion blur, but this is the only game to my knowledge that uses this dithered effect instead of the normal blur of other games. It sucks because the environments look really nice sometimes, and to have it all smudged by this dithered effect kinda ruins the whole picture. I know that motion blur itself makes things hard to see anyways, but this dithering just makes the details even less clear, and I just couldn't ignore it either, especially when it applies so harshly to the edges of objects and effects, like your boost. It was so bad, I thought my graphics options were messed up and I tried adjusting them. Unfortunately, the motion blur is not something you can alter, unlike Sonic Frontiers or literally any other modern game. Why not copy Sonic Generations in this aspect, where motion blur was present for that sense of speed, but toned down enough not to ruin the entire image, and also didn't have this dithered effect. And I'm not sure if it's just me, but a few areas can also look a bit flat or empty at times. It's more evident when the levels opened up a bit more, and there's a bit less detail when you slow down and take a closer look. You know, a weird lack of environmental detail and such. It's usually smaller touches that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but I did notice it on my first playthrough, when I wasn't blasting through every stage. As for the cutscenes, most of them are perfectly fine, but just like Frontiers, a few of them are oddly stretched or squashed a bit. This happened in Frontiers in one cutscene, and the same issue is here in 2 cutscenes as well. What's the reason? I'm not exactly bothered by it, but it just immediately sticks out to me because it's clear they squished the image. Is it for cinematic flair? An oversight? Outside of those issues though, the game looks really good altogether. The Hedgehog Engine 2 does a lot of heavy lifting here, especially for the lighting. It worked amazingly in Forces and Frontiers, and this game is no exception. The major difference here is art direction. Instead of bland settings and generic islands, we get a bunch of old game levels, which is much more visually interesting by default. It's kinda sad that we have to fall back on older games for better aesthetics, but that's neither here nor there. Now with the same engine in use, that also means issues like pop-in are still present. However, unlike Frontiers, it's not as egregious or noticeable. It's still there, and you'll definitely see it more in the Whitespace hub, but it's not like platforms will just pop up in front of you. Graphic settings are still painfully limited on PC, but I'm willing to give the game some flack for this. It's not like the game itself is graphically intensive or anything, and it ran just fine on my PC. OBS still dropped a few frames here and there, but trust me, it ran at a smooth 60. It can also run at 120 FPS if your PC can handle it, although a few in-game cutscenes are still locked to 60, with momentary stutters as a result. Still, I'm glad it's an option at all. Safe to say that the game looks stellar, with lots of flashy effects, dynamic environments, cool random flips, and nice little details. There's a handful of smaller gripes I have, but I'm content with what they offer here. An option to adjust motion blur or addressing the other issues wouldn't hurt though. And the same verdict generally applies to the music as well. Again, barely any original stuff here, it's mostly remixes you're listening to, but I'm glad to say that they're great remixes. Kingdom Valley, Rail Canyon, Sunset Heights, The Ark, and all the boss tracks are top notch. They're still faithful to the original compositions, but are given a nice, refreshing update, similar to how Sonic Generations handled its remixes. And since Act 1 consists of the main themes, Act 2 usually changes things up a bit, for better and for worse. Now, I'm not a musical aficionado or anything, so I apologize if my thoughts aren't articulated in a very clear way. First of all, Space Colony Art remixes Final Rush instead of... what's it called? Final Chase, that's it. I don't know why they remixed the Sonic stage instead of Shadows, but I get that Final Rush has a better melody going for it. But if you wanted a better melody, why not go for the arc from Shadow the Hedgehog? I guess Final Rush is more iconic overall, but it's an odd inconsistency. As for the negatives, the Arc's Act 2 remix isn't too good. I feel like this stage would have been the perfect opportunity to use the Arc's theme from Shadow the Hedgehog, but instead we get this lesser remix that just isn't appealing to me. It's okay, just not amazing, especially right after Act 1's remix. Unfortunately, the same goes for Radical Highway's remixes, for both acts. Act 1 takes way too long to get to the main melody. It's a whole minute before the stage's theme actually kicks in. Act 2 is closer to what I'd like to hear, but as a lead up to the final boss fight, it takes on this distorted tone. It fits the story and the stage itself, but I just wanted to hear a regular remix, man. I guess that's what Doomside provides, since he always brings you to Radical Highway with its own remix. These ones feel much more faithful in comparison, which is what I preferred more of. And as for most of the tracks, the use of dubstep is something I'm still mixed on. I just don't think it fits too well, but I'm glad it's mainly supplementary rather than the core genre of music. The sole exception to that is Chaos Island, and honestly, these are the worst tracks in the game. I just think it's funny how this comes after Sunset Heights with its amazing remix, and then Chaos Island comes in with the stage is not only lacking in aesthetics and gimmicks, but also music. And I can respect them for at least trying to make something nice. You know, they had to do something, but they're trying to make a remix out of piano ambience. What ends up happening is that the main melody is so basic and empty that the remix has to fill like half the song with dubstep, which has nothing going for it. It's just not good. Maybe with different instruments or genres it would sound better, but it's not a great track at all. The second act fares a bit better, but it still doesn't match the other levels, not by a long shot. At the very least, the basic music helped me focus a bit more on playing the game itself. It's so empty and subpar that I wasn't distracted by any catchy music, so I could just focus on reacting to upcoming objects. But those were the only issues I had with the soundtrack. The rest of it is just full of catchy remixes. I love how some second acts just amp up the original theme with a faster, more punchy remix. It really encourages that rush to beat the level as fast as possible. And having restarts or deaths keep the music playing is a nice quality of life change I can appreciate. It helps that restarts are also extremely quick, so speedrun attempts are less spent on loading screens. And the other tracks outside of the levels aren't bad either, specifically Shadow's themes. It's impressive to hear a few tracks change into a more mysterious tone, or hear what was originally an action track turned into something more subdued. And using his other themes for the white space challenges was surprisingly fitting. Just like the visuals, most of the music is really good, but a few sore points are still present and could use some work. Now, this game's story is quite interesting. It's much better than Sonic Gen's, since it actually has some plot going on. But when focusing on Shadow's past, there's plenty of plot points to tackle, especially from his own game. Just like Frontiers and basically any recent Sonic game, this game has an animated prologue online, completely optional and only supplemental to the game's main story. But just like Frontiers, I wish we could watch these scenes within the game itself instead of resorting to online websites only. Like, how would a random person who buys the game discover the online animated prologues for themselves? Besides, despite the lack of impact it has to the main story, it's still worth a watch given its quality and additional depth given to the characters. I mean, look at it. The choreography is insanely good, effects are nice, voice acting is on point. Can you believe this is all animated in 3D? Like, everything is 3D, not just selected backgrounds and models. Characters look convincingly 2D, and I didn't even realize it was until way after watching these. That's even more impressive given all the dynamic shots and certain animation techniques. Animation has gone a long way these past few years, it's actually wild. But back to the main plot. Right off the bat, there's a quick optional summary to Shadow's backstory, as it's kind of all over the place and only present in games that were released almost 20 years ago. So for newcomers or for people who forgot everything, in which case I don't blame you, the game offers a nice refresher to enjoy the game's story proper. And if you're expecting a spoiler warning like 30 minutes into the video, then here it is, I guess. I already covered like 90% of the game, but if you're concerned about the story only for some reason, then feel free to skip over this or just leave. I mean, the game's been out for a month at this point, so you know what, you do you. So Shadow travels to the Ark to seek out a potential threat, which turns out to be Black Doom seemingly returning out of nowhere. But once the Time Eater interrupts Sonic's party, Shadow travels to white space as well, except the levels and events revolve around his past. And instead of saving his friends, he's concerned about eliminating Black Doom, as he plans on returning through the Time Eater's time travel effects. This makes things a bit iffy when Maria and Gerald Robotnik are put into the equation, as they're also transported to white space from their time in the past. So it's really peculiar when Shadow finally meets the two most important people in his life after so many years, but from a time before they're taken away forever. So Shadow contemplates that maybe he can save them in some way. but for the time being he focuses on Black Doom. So he unlocks more powers, progression and all, but Black Doom reveals that the powers Shadow obtains are provided by Black Doom, and is his way of trying to take control of Shadow himself, as a way to return after their destruction. And Shadow is dead set on killing them off for good, but Maria calms him down and tells Shadow not to let the anger get the best of him. Soon enough, Shadow gains enough power to finally confront Black Doom, but reassures Maria that he's let go of his anger for the better. And it's nice that he gives a reassuring smile, small details. Gerald even apologizes for forcing Shadow to fight off Black Doom, because he's the one who made the agreement with him. And I'm wondering how that works into the story of Shadow the Hedgehog, with Gerald stating that the arc was built to defeat Black Doom. It probably works out, I don't know, time travel can be confusing. But, small side note, I can't get over the fact that the level text just exists during cutscenes. The original Generations never did it because it's there for gameplay reasons, but here they keep it present at all times, and I find it kind of funny whenever it's just present in a few shots. Like, we're in the middle of an important story cutscene and there's just some giant text sitting in the background like, hey, this is Sunset Heights, here it is. I don't know, I found it kind of goofy that it's always present no matter what. But by the end of the story, Shadow defeats Black Doom and things begin going back to normal, with him losing his Doom powers as well. However, that also means Maria and Gerald are now going back to their time, with Shadow realizing that this means losing them once again and practically setting them to their end. He wants to freeze time with Chaos Control so they don't disappear, but Maria stops him from doing so. And Shadow knows what happens if they go back to their time, but can't exactly tell them either. Maria comforts him though, and encourages him to move on despite how painful it might be. And reluctantly, he does just that, meeting up with Sonic in the final battle. I think this story does a lot right. At the same time though, I'm not a good critic when it comes to stories, so take what I say with a grain of salt. And I think they nailed Shadow's character here, and the reconnection with both Gerald and Maria are done tastefully without ruining their past interpretations either. The plot overall is structured really well and isn't too shallow or overambitious with itself. It utilizes the time travel plot point well, and with a character like Shadow, traveling through his past is bound to be significant in some way. It's a great story all around with no real issues in my eyes. Aside from the main plot, they have a few smaller tidbits that also do well in referencing past titles or matching up well with Sonic Generations. Shadow still confronts Sonic in the rival battle from Sonic Generations, and from Shadow's perspective, he has the Doom powers at his disposal, but refuses to use them. And when he ends up losing, he reveals that he's given Sonic a fake emerald, the same one that Tails used back in SA2, in which he found still aboard the Ark at the start of the story. It's a nice way to work around the original story without messing it up, while still granting Shadow his powers for gameplay purposes. The detail of Mephiles fighting to get back in the timeline is pretty neat, given that Sonic 06 was canonically erased from the timeline altogether, and other story bits are mostly small or optional, either for lore or more detail on certain aspects. For example, Maria's illness is acknowledged here, as in, it's obvious that it exists, but the illness itself isn't really specified in the cutscenes. That's where Gerald's journal comes in and fills the blanks. It's lore stuff. Creation of Shadow, the Bio-Lizard, Maria's illness, and those annoying blue chaos things in the Ark. All of it's detailed here, at least as far as I know. I kinda just skimmed over it, honestly. I can appreciate all the illustrations and stuff, but I'm not someone who looks into the lore of a game myself. If you're looking for extra details, it's probably here. But yeah, the story checks out just fine. Much better than what Sonic Gens offered, and I'm glad it isn't sloppily handled like Frontiers, or too shallow like Forces. It's kinda simple in scale, but for a game like this, I think that works just fine. I'm extremely glad to say that Shadow Generations is well worth your time. It certainly lives up to the standard of Sonic Generations, and that in of itself was probably a high bar, considering it was the last well-received title made by Sonic Team. Having the game bundled with Sonic Generations was a safe bet for sure, but since Shadow's campaign does just as well, you've got two amazing games all at the price of $50. It's not even a full price $60, which makes sense given that both games are pretty short. But considering that the original Generations was $20 on Steam, you could see it as an extra $30 for Shadow's part, in which case it's not a bad deal at all. Unfortunately, before this game was released, the original Generations was pulled off Steam and other platforms. And look, whether or not Sonic X Shadow Gens was successful, or if it became the definitive edition, and even if they included the original game in a legacy bundle, I'm still not happy with removing the standalone game. Having people buy a bundle for only one game is completely unnecessary, similar to how they delisted the classic titles in exchange for Origins and its sloppy release. And considering all the mods that were made for the original Generations on PC, you're losing quite a lot with just the Gens Remaster, no matter how good the game is. I'm glad that the original release is available in some form, but there really wasn't any need for the delisting. And the same marketing with the digital deluxe and all that stuff is really annoying. It's just obnoxious and confusing to see a bunch of bonuses for different versions and pre-orders. I'm just trying to figure out how much the game costs, but they keep throwing bonus items in my face. There's also a bunch of DLC with music packs and skins, which is cool and all, but locking certain music tracks behind a paywall is kinda stupid, and the skins are nothing interesting at all. The only exception being the Tyrio skin, which is the prototype design for Shadow. Unfortunately, that requires spending $10 extra because the skin isn't sold separately. I'm just glad it's all optional. The game is good enough without the extras. But if you're really itching to spend more money for some small bonuses, then be my guest. But back to Sonic X Shadow Generations. It's an amazing game, easily. Whether or not you're a fan of the series, the game is still worth giving a shot. Not only do you get a remaster of Sonic Generations, but you practically get a new game alongside it, which is just as good, if not better. You might find Shadow Generations short, but the bundle of Sonic Generations practically doubles your playtime. And the encouraged replayability of both games can last you much longer playtime if you get into it. Gameplay is refined and extremely enjoyable, visuals are spot on, most of the music is a great listen, and the story finally does something with Shadow's character after so many years. And one small side note, there's apparently some DLC for this game coming in December as a tie-in to the third Sonic movie. I can't really say anything about it though, not only because it's unreleased at the time of writing this video, but we don't really have much footage to make conclusions yet. I think it looks alright, the Shadow skin looks kinda weird, but his jump ball looks cool I guess. Maybe I'll try it if it's free, but I'm probably not paying for it. Certainly not making another video on it, unless something crazy happens. Outside of that, I think I've covered everything I wanted. It's good to finally get an excellent game in the series again. I can only hope that this isn't followed by another decade of garbage. Again, I don't want to be too cynical, but you never know. The series has always been a roller coaster of quality, but maybe this is the end of the cycle? Who knows? And I know this video took a while to come around, but I really wanted to let the game simmer for a moment. You know, enjoy the base game, complete what I wanted, and look into the speedrunning stuff. Sonic Generations is a game I hold in high regard, and I've played it for way longer than any sane person should. Shadow Generations had to live up to it if they wanted the two games side by side, and I'm really glad that it did. Besides, this is turning out to be my longest video yet, which is nice and all, but that means even more time spent editing, so sorry for the wait, but I hope it was worth it. Anyways, subscribe or whatever, here's some videos, and I'll be back for more later, whenever that'll be.